Well, thank you. You're welcome to sit down. And we are currently here for this year, for those who may be new or for those who may have forgotten, we're going through the book of Hebrews this year as one of our two sermon series. So you're getting two different parallel sermon series at the same time. And we are currently going through the book of Hebrews. You have your notes. There's a few points of review to make sure we're caught back up on where we are in the book of Hebrews. And the points I just want to remind us of in the book of Hebrews, first of all, is that the book of Hebrews very much focuses on the idea that God is speaking, that God has a message He is desiring to deliver to mankind. And we started the book of Hebrews with God at various times spoke in various ways, but now He has spoken by His Son, Jesus Christ. And then the rest of the book of Hebrews is going to slowly build up to this idea of who Jesus is and how much better He is and what that demands of us. The book of Hebrews is like a song that slowly gets bigger and louder as you go along. And it's exciting as we go through. Now, we have covered Hebrews chapter 1, and specifically Hebrews chapter 1 was about Jesus being better than angels. And there was a number of Old Testament quotes that reference different things about how Jesus is better than angels. And we moved through all of those over and over and over. The author quoted the Old Testament, and we got through. And that brings us now to Hebrews chapter 2. And today we're going to go through all of Hebrews chapter 2. Now, we'll let you know, we're not always going to do a whole chapter of Hebrews in these messages. But like I say, Hebrews is building towards something big. And so when we get to the bigger part near the end, we're going to slow down a little bit. So right now we are running quickly so that we can enjoy the full crescendo of the book of Hebrews. So Hebrews chapter 2 is where we're going to look today. And these first four verses are kind of have this idea that with a great message comes great responsibility. And specifically here, it is talking about what has been spoken before. So Hebrews chapter 1 talked about how Jesus is better than angels. And specifically, for those who weren't here, or if you forgot, specifically what the angels communicated had been the Old Testament law. That is what was believed and is the idea here. And so the original readers or the listeners to the sermon of the book of Hebrews, to them, angels were the ones giving and carrying out and speaking the Old Testament law. And it is with that idea then that the author in Hebrews 2 is now going to say, if the angels delivered the Old Testament law, and Jesus is better than that, if Jesus is better than angels, then a message that Jesus is speaking is better than what the angels spoke. That is the premise upon which we start chapter 2. And right there in Hebrews 2:1, it says, therefore, because of all that information, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away. Verse 2 is then going to expound the idea. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just reward, or just retribution. That is this idea that there was a clear message which demanded commitment. The idea being that the angels gave the Old Testament law. They spoke it, they gave it, and it proved to be powerful and true. And we watched, as we studied the Old Testament law last year, that when people deviated from the law, when they sought to do their own thing or to be their own person or try to enter the presence of God, what was there? There was immediate judgment for that sin. So what the author is saying is immediate judgment proved that the message was really true. I was watching a TV show the other day, and there was a few men driving cars, and they came to a fence, and it said, don't enter this field, it's a minefield. And they sat there and they debated, well, how do I actually know that there's mines in this field? The sign says it, but did they actually put mines in the field? Well, how would you test it out? Well, they sent one truck right through the field, and it didn't blow up. So then they determined that the sign was not as truthful. However, none of them actually drove through the field themselves. The idea is that an explosion would have proven the message to be correct. And in the Old Testament, the punishment that was promised by the law, when punishment happened, it proved that the message was reliable. And this is something that we see both in the Old Testament law, but it's also the challenge of being either a parent or a guardian or even a teacher. If you threaten a rule in your house and there's a consequence, how many of you have children who will test whether your word is accurate? Does anybody have children like that? I have one now who wants to investigate whether the message is true and steadfast. And so it takes the effort to do that. The Old Testament law, because it was true, people received a retribution. The clear message demands commitment. It was sure and held expectations. You need to act this way. You need to do this in order to approach or to be in or be close to the presence of God. We watched Nadab and Abihu get burned with fire because they tested that. However, Jesus has now given a new message, and it has been confirmed by God. That's we find out that in the end of verse 3 and 4, that there's this new message. And it says it was declared at first by the Lord. That's Jesus himself delivering this new message. And then it was attested to us by those who heard, meaning the author of Hebrews didn't actually get to go around and know and follow Jesus personally. So he's saying it was declared by the Lord, and then to people like me, those who spent time with Jesus told us about it. And then to make sure it was proven true, verse 4 says, God bore witness by signs, wonders, miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit. That is the idea. Now, I told you we are doing Bible study on Acts, and the beginning of Acts is lots of miracles, signs, and wonders. That is because God uses signs and wonders to confirm that he is actually delivering a message. That's why Moses, when he was sent to deliver a message to Pharaoh, he said, how will they know that I'm sending you? So what did God give Moses? He gave him a few signs to perform. Throwing his stick on the ground, it turned into a snake. Putting his hand in his cloak, it turned leprous. The idea being that God confirmed the messages with signs and wonders. And if you want to study something more in the future, I always try to give you extra homework. If you look throughout the Bible, there's really three main periods of time where there are groups of signs and wonders. The first one is the time of Moses and the Exodus, when they do the 10 plagues. They lead the people out into the wilderness. God gives the Old Testament law. At that time, God, through Moses and even some through Aaron, performed a lot of signs. That was God confirming that this new act of revelation and writing down the words of God was true and came from him. Now, we don't then see a whole lot of signs and wonders until we get to where? Well, it comes from the persons of Elijah and Elisha. So first we had Moses and then Joshua. After that we have mostly an ending of signs until we get to Elijah and Elisha. Now, why Elijah and Elisha? Well, at that time, God is moving into this idea of using the prophets to communicate very important messages, and many of these prophets were going to start writing down the words of God. And so we're going to have a lot of these Jeremiah, Isaiah, those books of the Bible are confirmed by another time of signs and wonders. But then the Old Testament prophets cease, Malachi ends, there's a long period of what? Quiet. Until God moves then with a new act of revelation by sending whom? Well, Jesus Christ, who performed what? Signs and miracles. And there's always two, Moses and Joshua, Elijah, Elisha, Jesus, and then the apostles perform signs and wonders. And that's what we see at the beginning of the book of Acts, confirming that there was new revelation, there was new words that were going to be written down, recorded, that God was messaging again. And throughout the Bible, that's the three main groupings of signs and wonders. The author of Hebrews is saying, we know this new message is true because God confirmed it by these signs and miracles. And thus, verse 3, which I skipped over at the beginning, says, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? You may want me to spend more time on that, but we're not going to, because this is the first of, in the book of Hebrews, there's 5 passages that are called warning passages. They are very strong phrases that are challenging the listeners to the book of Hebrews to really pay attention and to really make sure that they are careful, that they are watching what they're doing, they're acting correctly. And we're going to have a whole couple sermons just on these 5 warning passages. So we're going to come back to this passage in more detail later when we grab those together. But the author is being very clear that because we have a very certain message, we very much need to pay attention to it. And I really like that the author of Hebrews, the preacher who is giving this sermon, uses the word we. We must pay closer attention to what we have heard. He is including himself in that challenge. That's how we know that the man who wrote the book of Hebrews, who preached this message originally, knew his audience. He loved them. He cared for them. And he's going to say, we need to be careful. We need to focus. We need to listen to what Jesus said. Let's move on to verses 5 through 9, where we talk about this value of mankind, because we're going to come back now to this idea of angels again. He hasn't let this idea go, and he's going to say in verse 5, it says, it wasn't to angels that God subjected or gave the world to come, of which we are speaking. And then I like verse 6, how the author says, it's been testified somewhere. Anybody here ever want to quote a Bible verse, but you can't remember where it's from? I'm like that. When I was graduating Bible college, we had this big test where we had to sit with the professor who just asked us questions after questions after questions. And I was very nervous because I could quote a lot of verses, but I really struggled to remember the chapter and verse they came from. And here, the author of Hebrews says, it was testified somewhere. Somebody said this somewhere in the Old Testament. Now, I believe the author knew exactly where it was, but I like the phrasing. It makes me think that maybe he forgot where this came from in the Bible. Like I said, that's not what happened, but I like how he phrases it that. And then he's going to quote from the passage I read earlier, Psalm chapter 8. And he is going to specifically begin in the middle of Psalm 8 with that idea, what is man that you are mindful of him? And this is what he is doing to contrast humankind with angels. Because this quote from Psalm 8 reminds us of God's grace to all people. It's talking about the heavens, the wonder, the things that God has created, how big and amazing God is. And the psalmist is just overwhelmed with this idea, what is man? Who am I? Who are we as humans that you are mindful of us, that you think about us, that you care for us, that you love us? And then Psalm 8, if you still are back there sometime, he then talks about how humans were given dominion over the works of his hands, meaning the world that God shaped, he put under our control. Sometimes we forget that as people, as we busy ourselves with our life, that when God created this world and formed it and spun it into motion, he created humans, man, and the Hebrew word for man is Adam. That's where we get Adam from, the name Adam. He said, I'm putting you in charge of this world. Do we forget that sometimes? That this world, as you walk out and you see the buildings, the trees, the plants, the earth around us, the water, the ocean, the streams, the rivers, who did God leave in control of this world? It's you and me. And here are powerful angels who the author is referencing, who are these spirit beings who have done great and amazing things, who even delivered, according to them, the Old Testament law. And now he's saying, but it's not angels who are put in charge of this world. It's you and me. It's people. And specifically, one special person who he's now going to reference. He's now going to connect Psalm 8 with the person of Jesus Christ. And that's what happens after he quotes in Hebrews 2. He is going to come to verse 9 and says, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, specifically, or namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of what? The suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he may taste death for everyone. It's amazing that the author is saying the glory of Jesus comes through the suffering of death. And we're going to see there in verse 10 that he will make the founder of their salvation. This founder idea is the same thing as our theme verse in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. The author and finisher. The author is the founder, the beginner. It says perfect or complete through suffering. And you're like, well, how can you become complete or perfect through suffering? So I brought a little example for you. And this is thanks to Fabian, who has been working on this. So what I have in this hand is a crumpled up piece of aluminum foil. It was used in our kitchen a few days ago. And right now, it just looks like a ball of trash. And it's light, and I could throw it, you could catch it, you could kind of squeeze it a little bit, things like that nature. Well, what Fabian did is he took a large ball of foil, and I don't know if anybody's ever tried this before. It's one of those YouTube challenges. You can try it out. And he has been hammering this ball. So if I tap this ball of foil, it's very light. But if I take this is very heavy, and you can hold it later. But he has for a long time been beating this with a hammer over and over and over and over and over again. And then he started working on it with sandpaper, and he's gradually getting through finer and finer grit. The goal is eventually to make this into a very shiny, reflective ball. But the only way to take this big ball of garbage that he started with to get this really nice, heavy, shiny ball is to do what? To beat it, to rub it, to work on it over and over and over again. The project is only going to be complete through the suffering of this little ball. And the idea there is that it's not something that's not good because it's suffering. It's still aluminum. It's the same material, but it's becoming complete. It's becoming something special through suffering, through its beating. And it's that idea that we are given here, is that Jesus Christ, he was perfectly God and perfect man. He lived without sin, but the work he was sent to do, through which he got glory and honor, was accomplished through what? Suffering. It is through the suffering that he was crowned with glory and honor. God sent Jesus Christ and gave him a work to do, and it is through the suffering of Jesus, through that he is made complete, that the story of the goodness, of the grace of the gospel is made complete. And that is what the author is focusing on here, is that verse 11 says, he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he's not ashamed to call them brothers. And I've jumped ahead to the next point there, is that this Jesus then becomes a perfect comforter through his suffering. So because he has experienced this, he is now then able to care for you and for me. And this is common in our experience. Many of us who have experienced something difficult, we often find it easy if we find someone else who has experienced the same thing, right? I know when I was in younger grades, I looked with eager anticipation when I got to high school and I got to join the varsity football team. For those who are guests from the U.S., you would call it soccer. So I looked forward to that time, and I was excited to join these big kids, and they're playing in the football team, and I was excited for it. But there was a 2-week period I had to go through in order to become a member of the team. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced the initial few weeks of a football soccer season. Anybody ever done that before? You want to guess how much you actually touch a ball? It's not a lot. See, what happens is the coach gathers you in the heat of August before school starts, and what do? You do push-ups, you run, you do more push-ups, you jump, you run, and it is brutal, and it hurts, and it's difficult. And by so going through the suffering, you are able then to join the team. Now, the next year, you watch the new kids come up, and they're all nervous, and they're scared. How difficult are these 2 weeks going to be? Well, if you're kind and loving, you can share with them. I made it through. I did it. Now, I don't know any kid who went through that difficulty who was ever nice to the new kids. But the idea is that once you go through something, you're better able to comfort and love others who are then going through a similar thing. And Hebrews 2 is then drawing the attention to this idea that Jesus was able to connect with us through suffering. He's been made complete through his suffering, like we saw. That's between him and God. But now he's able to connect with us. And I really like what we see in verse 14 and 15. It says, "Since therefore the children," that's you and me, "share in flesh and blood, he himself partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil." And notice what it says in verse 15, "And deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery." The fear of death is what drives people into slavery. And this is a very, very true statement, because many people in the world are driven by just trying to stay alive. Does that make sense? You watch people go about their lives and work and live, so many are driven by a fear of dying. I used to interview people for my company. I was part of the people who would interview, and I would like to ask people, why do you want to work? And they would start to explain why they wanted to work for our company. I said, no. I didn't ask why you want to work here. I said, why do you want to work? And they would stop and say, well, I need money. Why? I need food. Why? And fortunately, my co-interviewers knew where I was going, and they would say, well, to live. And most people don't think about the fact that the reason they do a lot of things they do is why? To stay alive. But see, the fear of death, the Bible says here, drives people into slavery. Because if you fear dying, everything you do is driven by the avoidance of death. Do you know that is common amongst animals, right? Has anybody ever watched any animal shows or videos or anything like that, and one animal maybe grabs the neck of another animal? What does that animal do when its neck is grabbed? What does it do? It starts thrashing, kicking, everything it can do. Why? Because animals are driven by instinct, and they are driven by the pursuit of what? Not dying. That is what makes them who they are. Everything that they do is trying to recreate themselves, that's create offspring, and stay alive. Although some die as the process of creating offspring. But so it is persisting their species. That is all that they pursue. And the fascinating thing is that for most people, that is also their pursuit. That is why the Bible frequently refers to that idea that the natural heart of man, the natural part, is animalistic in its desires. So much frequently that it refers to the carnal mind, the pursuit of the flesh, the desire to stay alive or to bring pleasure to ourselves. That is the nature of mankind without something that overrides the fear of death. But when you go out into the world and you look at people who are living and working, and often for us, the thing that drives our daily actions is just the pursuit of staying alive. And that fear, the Bible says here, is a form of slavery. You are totally pursuing and overwhelmed by the avoidance of death. And the only way to escape from that here is having someone who can conquer death, who can defeat death. And that is what Jesus did. He had to become human so that he could die, so that he could defeat death, so that you and I would no longer be a slave to this world. We would not be a slave to staying alive. For many people out there, they believe that once they die, that's it. There's nothing more that happens. And if that is the case, there is not great reason to do or change your life in any way if you're not going to live after you die. However, the Bible teaches us that there is something on the other side of death. And not just there's something on the other side of death, but there's far more on the other side of death than there is on this side of death. Way more. But the choices we make in this life determine what happens on the other side. And Jesus came and he lived a rather short life on this earth so that he could conquer death. And verse 16, for the audience of Hebrews, he draws them down back to this idea of angels by saying it's not angels that he helps. Jesus did not do this for the angels, but the offspring of Abraham, human people like you and for me. And so it finishes with this idea that he had to be made like his brothers in every respect so that he could be a high priest and make propitiations for the sins of the people. Jesus' conquering of death as a human helps us to avoid acting out of a fear of death. And you say, well, what does a fear of death actually look like? And what does that mean for you and for me? Well, particularly, it means that we are driven to pursue the avoidance of pain and suffering. We're driven to avoid things that might threaten us or might scare us or might overwhelm us. And we avoid it. And that is natural because, like Deacon Henry mentioned, that even when Jesus was facing the act of physical death, did he want to pursue it in his physical nature? No, because all of us, from that natural fear of death, do not look forward to that process. It's not something we want to go through. But later on, after death, Jesus knew that there was something better on the other side. He had to go through it. And later on, we're going to get to Hebrews chapter 11. Like I said, it's going to build to other things. And there's this idea of Moses that he rejected the pleasures of this earth because why? There was something better that he was looking forward to. There's no way we can look forward to something better if Jesus didn't die on the cross. And that is what Hebrews 2 is setting us up for, because we have to remember, once again, that in the audience here, to them, Jesus was still a relative recent character in human history. They had heard stories. They'd even met people or heard sermons from people who knew Jesus. This was a real, regular person. So for them, it was very hard for them to grasp that he was God, that he was more powerful than these great angelic beings that you see throughout the scriptures. You know, these are people who grew up reading Ezekiel that talks about these creatures with 6 wings, these people who are in the presence of God, who are falling around his throne saying, "Holy, holy, holy." And to them, what happened to people who went in the presence of God? Well, they were consumed. But these angels could live in the presence of God. So for them, it was hard for them to picture and to really begin to grasp that Jesus was something so much better. I imagine this might be what the case is if you, I don't know if any of you personally know somebody famous or maybe grew up. I imagine that if you grew up and one of your siblings becomes famous, none of my siblings have become famous, but it's hard for you to picture why someone is famous. When you look out on social media, there's people who talk about all these people. Well, somebody grew up with these people while they were kids, right? And can you imagine if you grow up with someone who becomes famous, it's probably hard for you to understand the fame of someone you grew up with. You watched them with a runny nose, you watched them grow up and fall down and trip and all those different things. Now you look around and there's all these people who are like enamored with them. And it's like, well, you're just my brother. I don't get why you're so famous. It doesn't make sense. And you'd probably still make fun of them, right? For the people in the time of Hebrews, Jesus was still a recent character. And so for them, angels were better. There were so many things that were different and better. Why was Jesus so much different? And it's with that idea that the author of Hebrews is trying to really drill in and help people understand how much better Jesus is. Now, you and I, on the other hand, thousands of years later, we don't often think about angels. We don't often think about what they're doing or how angels are involved in our lives. I know we talk about it sometimes, and there's classes and sermons about it, and even sometimes television shows, although not as much anymore. For us, though, Jesus has become such a figure of our worship and celebration. We sing songs, we do so many different things, and we put a cross up and we celebrate his life and his death and his birth, and we are overwhelmed sometimes with the bigness and the greatness of Jesus Christ. That I like Hebrews 2 for reminding us that Jesus was what? A human. And in reality, most of Jesus' life is not recorded for us, right? We get a little bit of his birth, we get a little bit about him at age 12, and then we get a very, very condensed version of a few years near the end of his life. And that's it. And so we sometimes struggle to connect the idea of Jesus with being a human, with being a real person like you, like me. Someone who stubs their toe on something, or smashes their finger in a door, or with a hammer, or scrapes themselves on something. You know, these little trivial things. Or this morning I woke up and I told Charity, Well, not right when I woke up, but I said, I like to go running. I went running on Friday. I tried to run fast on Friday. Well, this morning I woke up excessively hurting because I tried to run faster on Friday, right? These are normal human experiences. And oftentimes we forget that Jesus experienced those things. We rightly celebrate and worship the person of Jesus and that he was fully God and that he died for our sins. But we have to remember that he also what? He lived for us as well. He grew up. The Bible tells us he grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. If he grew in favor with God and man, that means what? There are probably some people who didn't like him even from a young age, right? Because he grew in favor. I mean, people favored him more as he grew older, which means they probably didn't know much about him. And he had to meet new people, and he had to be polite, and he showed manners and experienced so many different things. Hebrews 2 is a reminder that Jesus is human. And while that may not seem overly important to you right now as you're sitting in church, the author of Hebrews is trying to help us to understand, especially with the very last verse of Hebrews 2, verse 18, it says, because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. We sometimes celebrate the power of Jesus that he offers to us through the grace of the gospel. And that is great and wonderful, and we should celebrate it. But let us also remember that in the quiet of our house, when we are struggling to make good food choices, or to make choices of what we think about, or what to do on our phone, when we are tired and worn out, and we don't want to be polite, and we don't want to be friendly to people. You know who also then experienced fatigue and hunger? It's Jesus. See, Jesus experienced the intricacies, the difficulties of human life as a human, so that he experienced those things which angels never have to put up with. Angels don't have to suffer aches and pains and sickness and watching friends die with cancer. Don't have to watch marriages and relationships being torn apart. Don't have to watch family members wander away from God. Don't have to be betrayed by people you thought were friends. But you know who experienced that? Jesus did. See, Jesus is not just there to offer us great power, but he's also there to offer us the example of living life. And I think it's important for us to sometimes return back to the idea that Jesus was tempted by Satan. And it seems like a spiritual battle of sorts. But even take one of the first temptations. Jesus had gone out to the wilderness to prepare, to pray, to fast, to focus his heart and mind on the ministry he was about to do. He's been a private person, not really out in the public eye. He hasn't done miracles. He hasn't done many things. And he is about to enter the ministry, as it were. And so he separates himself and he fasts. He must have grown weak and hungry and exhausted. And he's there, and Satan shows up and says, you know what you have power to do right now, Jesus? You can turn these stones into bread. And sometimes we let that waft past our heads and say, no, Jesus won't give in to that. But think with me of a day where you were in a rush or something happened and you missed eating anything in the morning. You didn't get any porridge, right? And then you're at work and you're working hard and your boss doesn't let you, and so you don't really get much to eat. And it comes time to 4 or 5 o'clock. How hungry are you? After one day. How hungry are some of us? Really hungry. And I'll eat most anything if I've missed 2 straight meals, right? And I want some food. Now remember, Jesus is fully human. And he has been resisting and holding back from eating food. Jesus was hungry, physically hungry, and Satan knows it. He says, you know what would be really nice right now? Some bread. You all have experienced the temptation of passions. Hunger maybe, but you've looked at things other people had and desired them. Maybe something was available to pick up. Maybe you struggled with lust or other desires. These passions, the desires that come and they flow and we wrestle with them. Often we do so quietly without telling any other person, because sometimes we feel we're the only person who has experienced the thoughts that we have in the back of our head. We're the only person who has experienced the anger that we feel toward a certain person. We're the only person who has been rejected and betrayed. Hebrews 2 is specifically there to remind the people of Hebrews, Jesus was a person. He hurt, he suffered, he struggled as a human, so that not only could we have life after death, but we could have the strength to live life now, to live, to resist, to overcome the temptations. It is Jesus who suffered while tempted to help those who are being tempted. The death of Jesus Christ and the life of Jesus Christ are both useful for you and for me. And the power of this chapter is reflecting the idea that while angels are powerful spirit beings, Jesus became a human for you and for me. Now I know I'm going to steal a little bit ahead, but we're going to celebrate the act of, or the ordinance of communion, Lord's Supper, in a little bit. And part of that is flowing out of this idea of Hebrews 2. Jesus became flesh and blood. That's what it says in Hebrews 2:14. Since therefore the children, that's you and me, share in flesh and blood, he himself partook of the same things. It's actually a play on words here. He partook of the same things. He partook by being flesh and blood, right? By becoming the exact same things, by having a physical body and physical blood that ran through his veins, by experiencing the pain of growing, of hurting himself, of all of those things. He became that so that he could die. So that's why on the night before he died, he took bread and said, this is my body, my real physical body, which is going to be broken for you. This is my real physical blood. I'm actually going to bleed. I'm going to experience excessive blood loss and go through many physical weaknesses and struggles because of that blood loss. For you. Jesus was not killed instantly or humanely. He was beat. He was whipped. He was scourged as he died. He was tempted. He struggled. He suffered as he lived. You and I are living a life of suffering and trial, aches, pains, temptations, thoughts, struggles, and so often we keep it closed, we keep it held up, we don't share it with our family, we don't share it with that, and we often don't even pour it out to Jesus Christ, who offered his life and his death for you and for me. He was made complete through suffering. If Jesus Christ himself was made complete through his suffering, why do we often suffer in silence? Why do we often live a life trying with our own strength to overcome temptation and to change our lives, change our attitudes, change our actions without going back to the person of Jesus Christ, to the words that he wrote, to the things that he said, to the life that he lived? He has offered us so much. We must allow Jesus Christ to help us, to be that person who we can look to and worship. I'm going to go ahead and close in prayer, and then we'll soon wrap up. Like I said, if you want to stay for communion, but I want you to, as we pray, to consider and think about, is there anything you're struggling or fighting in your mind, in your heart, in your life, in your relationships, in your things that you have been holding on to and trying to overcome on your own? Someone you've been butting heads with, or a passion or desire that keeps coming up and you're trying to push it down on your own. Hebrews 2 is calling for us to say Jesus was human, to give us life, to give us hope, to give us a future, and to give us help. I encourage you to, in prayer, turn to God today, turn to Jesus Christ and say, I need your help with this. This chapter says, who through God thought it fitting to bring many sons to glory, to bring them with him. He had to come here, and he's going to bring us with him, bring many sons to glory. There's a song, how deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. The writer of that song was reflecting this idea that Jesus became human to bring us with him in glory and hope and love and victory to heaven to share with him. Jesus was God, but Jesus was human like you and me, made lower than the angels so that he could live, love, serve, and provide for us an example and hope and help. Let's pray.